as you can see here, this is my blog. It's jamestabor.com. So if you know my name, you can get to it. And it has a good search feature and it has hundreds and hundreds of posts. So you can almost query anything, but let's just take your query. Let's do Ebionites, and I hit return. There's several articles, but I was going to refer you to this one. Ebionites and Nazarenes tracking the original followers of Jesus. Now, if we click on that, so you can go do this yourself, you can print it out. This is a fairly nice article overview that answers your question, but we're not going to read it all. I just want you to know that it's here because it goes into great detail. But at the end, there's a nice summary. We've got 4 points where they're numbered and lots of sources and other things you can read. Like here's that Hebrew Matthew I just mentioned. Some of these things are linked. So here are the main things, and we won't read this word for word, but we'll hit the high points. As far as the Ebionites go, and I'll get to the Nazarenes because this is both. Jesus is a human being with a father and a mother. They do think he's a Messiah, meaning he's anointed of the Spirit. This is from Isaiah 61. Okay, they're big on that. We have that in the New Testament in Luke 4. The Spirit has anointed me and so forth. But they like the term prophet like Moses. Now, that's also in the New Testament in the book of Acts. In Acts 7, Stephen says, he's the prophet like Moses. If you remember, the prophet like Moses is the one who will come like Moses, whom the Lord will know face to face. So they had a very high view of Jesus, but as a human being. So he's a flesh and blood human being, born of a woman. Born of a woman doesn't mean, but virgin born. It means you're a human being in Hebrew. Secondly, this is surprising. They're vegetarian. They don't like eating meat at all. And they think the temple slaughter of animals was added. They don't think it was originally given by God, but it was added either from the people's sins or, as Jeremiah 7 says, I did not ever command you to do this, but only to seek my ways and follow me. If you look that up, Jeremiah is in the temple, and he says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you filled it with shedding innocent blood, referring to the animals. And he calls it a den of shredders. I know it's translated robbers. That's a mistranslation. It actually is a word that means to rip apart, literally. And of course, robbers jump on people and stab them and rip them apart. But it's used for a ravenous lion, for example, in the book of Isaiah. Same word. Okay. But part of this is let's go back to the original way. For example, Moses allows divorce, but Jesus says, wonderful Ebionite phrase, from the beginning it was not so. You see that idea? So eating meat, yes, it's allowed in Genesis 9 with certain provisions for shedding blood. But ideally, remember, I've given you every green plant to eat. So they're trying to go back to Eden, so to speak. And divorce and eating meat would be 2 examples. And then they believe in following the Torah, but they think that lots of things, this is part 4, have been added to the Torah, like wheat and tares. A field is the word of God. It's sown in a field. And they believe that there are things in the Torah that have been added by the priests, particularly that are not really of the Torah. Now, we would call that today historical critical study, but also of the Torah. They believe in, so that's sort of an overview. Now, they also generally have a negative view of Paul. And there might have been branches later. People start saying, well, Nazarenes are not like Ebionites. There's a church father named Epiphanius I'm going to talk about in a second. I just want to recommend that article to you. Now, if you go back here to my beginning page, just so you know all these sources, I want your people to realize it has books and it has online courses and all this, but this you might find very helpful. all kinds of background on the Jewish Roman world of Jesus. These are original sources. And here's an example of what I put blog posts up all the time, and you were going to ask me about this later. But I just did a video on the Shroud of Turin, and we'll save that for the end. But this is talking about that. There's a blog post. So the videos often have an introduction. This is one I just put up, and it's going crazy on my YouTube. Is Mark the earliest surviving Jewish text after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed? Think about that. And if you read Mark, what I argue in this video, this is a new idea for me. I changed my mind. I learned new things. I didn't know this 5 years ago. And now I think it's pretty persuasive. You probably haven't seen it yet, Jeremiah. I want to see what you think of it. What I argue is that in 7 ways, Mark is telling people, here's how to follow the God of Israel now that there's no temple and Jerusalem is destroyed. So think, who is God? It quotes the Shema. And it says, if you love God and love your neighbor as yourself, this is more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Kind of sounding Ebionite, right? And what about the purity laws? Traditions of men that have been added, you see? And it's really what goes in the heart and so forth. So you could even look at that. Those just happen to be up there. So I wanted to mention them. But here's another document, and I'll be curious to see if you've seen this one. There is a church father, as we call them, church authority, and we're going to look at this right here. But he writes a book called the Panarion. That's a Greek word, and it means medicine chest. Now, he's an Orthodox Trinitarian Christian. He's after Constantine. He's around 370, so he's 4th century, and he is Orthodox, supporting Christianity, absolutely believing in Paul. In fact, Paul's his main guy. Now, you notice this says number 18. Guess what? The book has 2 volumes printed in English. It's 80 heresies. So it's the medicine chest to cure you of 80 false beliefs, Jews and Christians that are called heretics. So he thinks these Nazarenes and Ebionites are not true Christians. So in chapter 29 and 30, you can look it up on the internet. These are available. He covers the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, and he tries to make them different. In my article that I showed you on my blog, I argue that they're basically the same in the early days. In other words, Nazarene is a term that the followers of Jesus had. There's Jews still call them today Nazarenes, Christians, Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus the Nazarene. And we think that's from Isaiah 11:1. That's more what convinces me. The branch, so they're branchites. They believe in the branch of David. They're waiting for the branch of David. So that's the later groups that he describes, and he does not like them at all. He hates the Ebionites. In fact, Ebionite means poor ones. Jesus said, blessed are the Ebionites. Blessed are the poor ones. If he was speaking Hebrew, it would be, blessed are the Evonim, the poor ones, poor in spirit, right? Isaiah 66, to this person I will look. God says, not to the temple. He says, what is the house you'll build for me? Ebionites love this verse. Heaven is my throne. The earth is my footstool. What's the house you're going to build for me? I often say, I might have said this in the last episode we did, there are 2 things God says he never wanted. He didn't want Israel to have a temple and a human king. I never asked for a temple. Why are you wanting to build me a temple? I don't want a temple. But, okay, they built him a temple. And why do you want a king? I'm your king. They like that kind of idea. So the Messiah is a king, but the word king is misleading. In Judaism, the prayer is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, but Melech HaOlam, the king. Only God is really the king. We say a prince is lower than a king, but in Hebrew, a prince is Nasi, and really the Messiah is Nasi. He's the prince of the congregation. So if you want to go back to Jesus, he probably would have been called a Nasi, which means a ruler, a prince. God is the king, Melech. So anyway, back to this chapter 18. Here's what's tricky about this. Of the 80 heresies, he starts with Jewish. Look, it's number 18 of the series. It's number 5 from Judaism, but 18 of the series is a whole series, and 5 are Jewish. This is Jewish. So this is not Christian. But this is Nazar, not Nazor. So for Epiphanius, Nazor is the later group. But here's Nazar, a sect of Judaism. But look where they live. They live across the Jordan in Transjordan. They practice Judaism, like circumcision and the Sabbath. And also here, they recognize Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the fathers, and so forth. But they wouldn't accept the Torah as it's come down from the Jewish tradition. They think it's been polluted or things have been added to it. And look again, they would not sacrifice or eat meat. They claim that the books have, forgery is a strong word, but I would call it interpolations. So it sounds almost like the later group that we just read about, right? But this is an earlier group. So it shows that there's a precursor. For example, you mentioned Qumran. At Qumran, they say in the community rule, we will build a temple of men, of people, a temple of people, and our prayers will be our offerings, not the blood and the Holocaust offerings of animals. That's in the early text of Qumran. Now, we talked about this last time. Remember, Qumran, I like to call it the Dead Sea Scroll group. Forget the name. People say, well, you mean the Essenes, right? Well, that's one name, but what does it mean? We mentioned last time, it might mean Osim HaTorah, the doers of the law. But remember, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the things they say is that David had many wives because he didn't have the seal book of the Torah. The seal book of the Torah they claim to have, the real Torah. Okay. So they're doing historical critical reading of even the Torah, and they think other things were added. Jeremiah 7 again, and the day I led you out of Egypt, I did not command you concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. Amos says the same thing. Did I command you when I led you out of Egypt? So their position was these things were added later. And in their texts, what we call the Hebrew Gospels, the Ebionite Gospels, they say things like, they have Jesus say things like, if you do not cease sacrificing, shedding this innocent blood in this temple, the wrath of God will not be removed from you, or it will fall upon you, and so forth. So that's a brief overview. The people, remember, we know about them mainly from the people that hated them. So they're going to give all kinds of negative things about them. But they're not fans of Paul. They think Paul came along, the Christian version of them, so-called Christian, post-Jesus. They think that Paul taught heresies. And they even question whether he really saw Jesus. He's the 13th apostle. But their basic argument would be a pretty simple one. Do you go by the ones who are with Jesus and followed him, and the ones to whom Jesus said, I will make you rulers over the 12 tribes of Israel? Should you go by them, or should you go by a 13th guy that comes later and says, well, I saw Jesus and he told me this, that you should break bread as his body and take a cup of wine as his blood and drink it and eat his body and blood, and through that you'll be saved. Now, did Jesus say that is the question? See, it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke because Mark has it, but Mark probably gets it from Paul. So it's I know it sounds complicated, but we can sort it out. It actually sorts into two piles. And this pile over here would never think of drinking blood or even symbolically drinking blood. I'm not accusing sincere Christians of cannibalism or anything like that. That's not the point. They have a deep spiritual meaning in their own lives. I grew up with it. I try to be gentle with people. But if you think about it, I don't think that would be an image that would be used by a Jewish person, particularly coming from the tradition that you abstain from blood, and even the requirement on Gentiles in Acts 15, if they join the Nazarene movement, they have to be sexually pure, worship the one God, no idols, and not eat blood or sacrifice the meat sacrificed to idols, and particularly the blood. So that's the sort of thing that you get into. So they didn't like Paul, and they would argue visions are one thing, but how do we know what you're seeing? You say you talked to Jesus. Well, we talked to Jesus, but guess what? We touched him and knew him and heard him firsthand, and he never said any of those things. That was the Ebionite argument. And
Mhm.
it's a pretty good argument if you accept it. So Paul says things like, we no longer know Jesus after the flesh. After the flesh means a human being. Even if we once did know him that way, we no longer know him that way. Almost as if to say, okay, yeah, you knew him, but I know him after the Spirit. Almost like you would claim, I've got the latest word from Jesus. You guys are out of date. Yeah, you knew him, but that was before his death. And now I've got all the new revelations that he's given me. So they weren't so sure that you could follow the latest new revelation. If you go down that path, what do you find all through church history? Well, the first thing you find is Muhammad comes along very early and says, well, I have a new revelation, and it's Abrahamic, and you should follow
Mhm.
this rather than that. And then if you really want to jump to American history, but think of the Mormons. And they would still say we follow the Bible, but through the Book of Mormon, it's going to now get interpreted and so forth. So, this idea of later revelations coming by visions of angels or visions of any type, even if it's finding golden plates that will have the new revelation, they would go like, wait a minute. Let's stick with the original. What did God really want when he made human beings? No divorce, peaceful kingdom. And then they would go to the end of the Bible, Isaiah 11. What is the Messiah going to do? They're not going to hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. And the word destroy is shachat, to slaughter. See? Because the wolf will
Mhm.
lie with the lamb, and
Mhm.
there'll be peace, and the nations will be at peace. So they would say, look, we have the original ideal, and then that was left behind after the flood, and then violence filled the earth, and all these other innovations came in, and the prophets come along and try to take us back to the ideal. And then Jesus finally comes, and they thought he was kind of the final prophet. They weren't looking for another. God's spirit rested on him, and he was became the anointed one, the prophet like Moses. So you can drill into that a little more, but that's a good overview, I think.